It was December 27. I was in bed with a fever, yet I felt more elated than ill. Something about the consciousness I was swimming in, living, being in, seemed strangely familiar, as if my vision were coming into focus after a lifetime of double images. Without the calm reasoning guidance of the voice I heard speaking to me, I am not sure I would have made it through this stage. But someone, or something, was helping me along, identifying itself as a part of me that I had forgotten, an eternal part. I am a spirit being in the eternal fields of light, it said. I'm you, as you remain beyond material illusion, as you were, will be, and are now, before and after the spell of matter. My handwriting being quite illegible, my only method of recording anything of the amazing stream of consciousness I had somehow stumbled upon, was to type what I could of it on an old Royal portable typewriter, that my brother-in-law found sitting on the curbside one day, as he made his rounds as a garbage collector. But it was a strange sort of communication, unsettling at first. I found myself experiencing a consciousness radically different from anything I had ever before encountered. And it was too close for comfort. I felt as if something enormous were looking through my eyes, seeing the same room I saw every day but interpreting it so differently. Mathematically it seemed that I hardly recognized even the most familiar of my daily objects. The thoughts, the ideas, the scope of the images. I was not used to thinking in such terms. I was unprepared, and not always able to follow. I balked in outright disbelief when the voice first suggested that this was some kind of extraterrestrial intelligence I was encountering. An explanation that even now I do not accept without qualification. But despite the fact that my mind frequently lagged behind, on an emotional level my heart and soul were experiencing a blissful, almost sexual, feeling of fulfillment. I felt a peace that I could not account for, a sense of well-being deeper than I had ever known. When I understood what was being said, it was so wonderful that I felt like a child on Christmas morning. In a strange way it was almost as if I were remembering things rather than being told them. It was all I could do to keep my fingers in the vicinity of the ancient machine that, thanks to a generous dose of WD-40, was continuously tapping out some partial account of the thoughts that were rippling wave-like through my awareness. Several times I forgot to put wood in the stove until my numb feet reminded me of the winter creeping in under the door. When this experience continued into a second day, I told my wife, Sherry, that although I did not understand what was going on, I felt a need to follow through with it and see where it was leading. I asked her to make sure that I was not disturbed for the next few days. If our friends or neighbors come over, I said, ask them to come back another time. I need to be isolated until this process, whatever it is complete. That night, 6 inches of wet snow blanketed the forest around our home. By morning all the younger pine trees along both sides of the 1-mile dirt road that ends in our yard had bent over under the snow's weight. There must have been 100 of them bowing protectively across the road when I looked out the window the next morning. Since we had no electricity, television, or radio in those days, the snow-laden trees effectively cut off all access to the outside world. And they remained that way until the transmissions were complete. The fact that I had not previously known how to type must have been overlooked in the swirl of heightened consciousness, for when I awoke on the morning of January 6, 1979, there were 350 double-spaced typewritten pages stacked upon my desk. And my life had forever and irreversibly changed. Throughout those 11 days, as I was typing the notes that would later be published as the Starseed transmissions, I was told again and again by the entities who were blending with me that a much stronger surge of telepathic awareness was to be pulsed into the collective field of human consciousness between the years 1987 and 1989. It was emphasized that this would be far more powerful than the thought signals I was then receiving. This prediction turned out to be as precise as if it had been drawn from a moon calendar or a table of the tides. 10 years later, during the same period, telepathic messages began coming in, like subtle music in the background of my thought at first, then stronger, and finally with such power that I decided to stop everything and begin recording them. Since what I had captured on paper in the earlier starseed transmissions was such a small percentage of the overall information flow I had received, I had resolved by this time to be better prepared. By speaking aloud into a tape recorder while receiving this present material, I was able to bypass the manual distractions of the typewriter and translate much more of the awareness into the spoken word. Afterward, precise word-for-word transcription on a word processor brought into printed form a far more detailed and substantive account of the consciousness flow than had been possible 10 years earlier. Admittedly, my process was not perfect. I still had to stop now and then to put a log in the stove or adjust the window, but my distractions were kept to a minimum, and I am very happy with the result, which I am pleased to share with you in the form of this book. It was written during a season of global miracles. No local snowstorm this time. In the 1970s I needed the validation of the dramatically timed snow cover to remind me that I lived in an intelligent and benevolent universe. Now I wonder how I could have ever forgotten. But what exactly is this process? I have yet to find a single word that adequately describes it. After a decade of hearing the term channeling bandied about, I am convinced that it does not apply to the process through which I access this information. I know many people who regularly tap into this awareness and I expect they will agree. There is no trance involved in my reception of these thoughts, no loss of consciousness, no voice change or foreign accent. I am fully present throughout the experience. During the months that followed the recording of those first starseed transmissions, I began to realize that accessing higher frequency awareness is actually an organic process, a natural ability with which every child is born. I have since devoted several years to studying preschool children, and though my work is not scientific and far from conclusive, I am personally convinced that this inborn ability usually atrophies with the acquisition of language. As children develop language skills, they acquire the prevalent cultural belief that if it cannot be put into words, it is not real, or at least has no value or relevance. Since higher frequency thought, or what is sometimes called metapersonal thought, is entirely nonverbal, as children are inculcated with cultural values they gradually stop noticing that they are living in a veritable ocean of nonverbal awareness. Can you imagine something so prevalent that it is entirely forgotten? As in the joke in which the student fish asks the philosopher fish, "What is this ocean you keep talking about?" But perhaps atrophy is too strong a word. The ability to access higher frequency thought can, of course, be reactivated. In a few cases, like my own, that reactivation occurs by accident, but, as thousands of letters bundled in our storeroom attest, it can also be reactivated intentionally. The central chapters of this book take a closer look at this. They are sufficiently detailed to provide those interested with the basic tools of understanding required to regain their spirit world sensitivity. Once you know what to look for, it is not difficult. It is essentially a matter of listening, of sensing, of feeling more fully, of opening to frequencies of thought that are normally filtered out of awareness. I experience it as a process of relaxing into a more generalized and generous definition of self, a sort of spreading out, as it were, into a larger field of awareness. That larger field of awareness includes my center of human individuality, but it includes other centers of individuality as well. I experience these as aspects of myself. Not my human self, but that deeper eternal self that all creatures share. Call the process what you will. Channeling, creative thinking, visioning, or simply perceiving more fully. It has opened me up to ways of considering reality that I am certain would not otherwise have occurred to me. In practical realms such as relationships, child rearing, gardening, and finance. It has introduced ingenious perspectives and creative interpretations that have proven themselves again and again. I sometimes wonder how different the course of my life might have been had I learned to listen earlier to these inner frequencies. So much has changed since those 11 magical winter days. When I recorded the original Starseed transmissions, I was a rural carpenter who had been supporting a family for the past 6 years on an income of less than 1/3 of what was then officially defined as the U.S. poverty level. Our garden and milk cow ensured that we always had plenty of wholesome food, and though Sherry and I put in long hours, we were both relatively content. I enjoyed my work and anticipated a future along similar lines. Today my life is so different, so radically altered, that at times I flash back to those pre-Starseed days and recall them with the black and white associations usually reserved for old photographs. Even now I can hardly explain the change. It was like suddenly poking my head up through the clouds to see the sunlight for the first time, or discovering a vast new world beyond the cultural stage props that had previously defined my reality. Something happens to you when you begin to think about this planet as a single living organism. And when you begin to live in that awareness, nothing is ever again quite the same. Nothing can be the same after that. Nations began to look like people to me, like familiar friends. The distinctions between religion, biology, and politics began to blur. I began to wonder why I had always assumed that human thought was the only kind of thought. As if nature would be content with a single species of flower, or just one kind of tree. Whether or not you accept my own premise that the current of consciousness recorded in the following chapters is of angelic or extraterrestrial origin should in no way affect your experience of this book. The perspectives presented here are designed to stimulate your own processes of thought and understanding. Their purpose is catalytic, to trigger memory and awaken higher dimensional sensitivity. I recommend taking your time before drawing too many conclusions about this material. Many of my own early assumptions proved invalid as I became more immersed in the consciousness behind the words. We take identity too seriously. It isn't a fixed commodity like a table or a chair. Healthy individuality is a fluid flowing focus of awareness, adjusting naturally to the ever-changing contours of time. It knows itself as one of many eyes of eternity, coalescing in an infinite sea of shared being. Individuals come and go like the waves of the sea, but at their core each one is first and foremost the sea, and only secondly the wave. Cultural programming prevents us from realizing this. It discourages true individuality. There have been a few genuine individuals during historical times, but not many, and those, of course, were individual because they knew the eternal being at their core. Some of the views and principles presented here may be new to you, others more familiar. But experiment with them. Apply them. See if they work. Let your own experience determine their degree of relevance. None of them are presented as absolute statements of truth. Truth does not lend itself to absolutes, linguistic or otherwise. The world has seen enough dogmatism. This book is about spirit. It is written for people of spirit. If these words help even just a few of us to become more aware, they will have served their purpose. Ken Carey, Greenwood Forest, Missouri.